Travis, brother, how you doing?
Good. And you?
Well, it was 110 degrees in some parts of LA today, and that really stinks. But a little trouble in paradise is okay once in a while. I don't
In the
mind.
summer, it's like 120 degrees in all parts of Southwest Georgia.
Yeah.
So it's par for the course, my man.
Yep. Well, listen, we talked last week. By the way, this is Travis and Ross with Notes On, where we try to do Christ on purpose. And last week we talked about your
By the
debate.
way, you know what I love about you?
What's that?
You always forget to do the Christ on purpose thing, and you always have to retreat and go, "Oh yeah, this is Travis." I think you've done that 20 times in a row.
I,
I
I,
mean,
I
I
get
haven't been keeping score, but I'm humored by it. I love it.
I get so excited about talking to you, and then it's like, oh yeah, I got to say this because it's really important to me. I mean, it was my idea to
That's your
do that.
baby. That
What's
was
that?
your idea. That's your
Yeah,
baby. That intro.
I know,
That's
and I
you,
and I
man. This,
and I muff it every time. How serious am I about it?
hey, man.
Oh
The whole
man,
world is confusing.
this is
So
sad.
the fact that your intro is out of whack is I guess is okay.
It's right in
I think we'll
line.
forgive you. It's right
Great.
in line with the world,
That's right.
the way things are.
Oh man. So we're still talking about your that fabulous 3.5 hour debate you did. And last
That some
time
people slept through. It's been great for a cure for insomnia for some people.
I watched it. I watched the whole thing.
I
I
believe
honestly
you.
did. Yeah.
I'm impressed.
I really learned a lot. And so what I would like to know, what I'd like you to do in the half hour that we have is review the basic idea of the what was the debate, what were the two sides. You were defending classical theism.
Yes.
Your two interlocutors were um, saying that classical theism is not true, and you were with Richard Howe, who's a really terrifically good guy. Why don't you tell us what is classical theism, what does that entail, and then how did you defend it, and just sum up the debate in 15 minutes if you can.
Classical theism, as we defined it last week, is the view of God that says that God is not merely all knowing, all powerful, and all good, as Abrahamic theists generally take God to be, but there are other great making properties or great making attributes that are true of God, qualities that God possesses. Um, and the big three would be things like God's absolute timelessness, God's absolute immutability that follows from that timelessness, God's impassibility, which says that God, his emotional life is in no way determined by the creature. And then finally, simplicity, the view that all of God's attributes are actually one in him, that God is in no way composed of parts. Um, he can't be composed of physical parts because he's immaterial. And even his attributes are not really distinct in him. And we got into some of the things last week about that, like some of the issues, at least as to why those of us in the tradition hold to that. And the classical theistic tradition is, in my opinion, best expressed in the work of Thomas Aquinas. I see him as sort of classical theism come into its own, where all the kinks are sort of removed. He grounds it in a metaphysic that it was actually given by Aristotle, and Thomas actually improves on that metaphysic by reading Exodus 3 in the way St. Augustine did, who saw Exodus 3 as an expression of the fact that in God there are no distinctions, no distinction between essence and existence, no distinction between matter and form, no distinction between God's actuality and potentiality, or passive potency, as we would say. So that's, in a nutshell, what classical theism is. And what I did is, instead of even getting into the details as to what that means, I just gave the argument.
Mm-hmm.
So after a brief introduction where I distinguish between different types of theists, I started the argument with just the fact that there are contingent things. A contingent thing being something that is changing and finite and dependent upon other things for its existence. Now, I'm not going to unpack that here. I will not repeat the debate, but what I did is I unpacked that and what that means, not just physically, but even metaphysically. What does that mean? And then the next premise is that anything that is contingent has to be currently caused to exist by another. So it is not the case, for example, that I exist as something that just doesn't need a cause right now. I needed a cause for my conception. I needed a cause for my birth. But now that I'm here, I can pretty much get along without anything causing me to exist currently. We know that's not true. I need a bunch of things that keep me together. The atmosphere, the air I breathe, the food I eat, and so forth. And again, I gave not just that kind of physical argument that I'm giving now, just based on physical observations. I gave a metaphysical argument for that. So I'm grounding my understanding of God in metaphysics. Physics being just the material world around me, metaphysics being the ultimate constituents of what reality is.
Mm-hmm.
And the next premise would therefore be there are at least two things that exist in the cause-effect relationship. Because if I'm currently caused to exist by something other than myself, then there must be something other than myself that causes me to exist. And so there are at least two things that exist in the cause and effect relationship. Now, if that's true, if there's me and I'm caused by something else, what is that cause caused by? Well, if there are only two things that exist in a cause-effect relationship, then the cause is uncaused because there's nothing causing it. And so we've already arrived at a major conclusion in the argument, but our interlocutors don't want to go there. So the best thing you can do at that point is postulate that the cause that is causing me is itself caused by something else. In other words, I'm a contingent thing that is caused. I'm sustained by something that is itself contingent. And now we're off and running. So the question is, can there be an infinite regress of contingent causes of being? And my answer, Thomas's answer, classical theists answered no, because even if you have an infinite number of these caused causes, the question now is, how do you account for the sum total of them? Because you do have a sum total of caused causes. And so you can speak of the whole series of caused causes. And if every member is contingent, then the whole is contingent. I worded it a little bit more carefully in the debate, but that's essentially the case. And therefore, if the whole series is contingent, then the whole series is caused by something other than itself. Now, that cause of the whole series cannot be caused by another. It cannot itself be contingent, because then it would not be the cause of the whole series.
That's right.
And therefore, it must be uncaused. And at that point, we are now asking the question, what is the nature of this uncaused cause? How many are there? Notice when you get to this conclusion that there is at least one uncaused cause, you don't know yet whether this uncaused cause is one or many. Maybe there are an infinite number of uncaused causes. Who knows? You don't know if this uncaused cause is material or immaterial, finite or infinite. You just said, all I know is there's just one of them. Okay. But as you begin to reflect on what you have to be an uncaused cause of all of these contingent things, you begin to realize, well, it can't be changing and finite and dependent upon other things, because then it would be contingent.
Right.
So then it therefore has to be unchanging, infinite, and independent. And it can't be, therefore, something that came into existence, because then it would need a cause for its existence. And so it must be eternal. It must have always been here. And its eternity has to be without succession, because then it wouldn't be immutable if it were, or unchanging if it experienced succession of moments. So you see how we can just sort of immediately begin, as Richard Howe would say in one of his essays, these attributes of the uncaused cause just begin to cascade. And then you match them up against what theists have always said about God. And you're like, well, this is God, right? I mean, everything that Thomas says about God, we have to say about the uncaused cause. And so, as the Westminster Shorter Catechism says, God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchanging in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. That's how we understand God to be. Well, that's the uncaused cause, and that therefore follows that the uncaused cause, who is God, exists. So that's basically the way I presented the argument. It took me 25 minutes. I just boiled it down to about 7 minutes. And I don't know. I just think the argument really holds together, and I enjoyed the interlocutors because they understood the argument. They were not accusing me of trying to argue that the universe began to exist. Richard and I are proponents of the Kalam cosmology argument. We both think that it's sound, but we think this one is better because it assumes, for the sake of discussion, that the universe is eternal, that it's always been here. And we're saying that even if the universe is eternal, even if we grant the atheist's grand assumption, you still have to have a God that sustains this universe. And that is quite a conclusion when all is said and done. And so I'm going to just sort of stop and let everybody breathe and let you maybe throw a question or two at me. But that's the gist. That's the argument.
I want to ask you sort of a personal question based on this argument, and that is, ever since I've known you, this is a big deal argument to you personally. I can tell. I know this is a difficult question to answer, but how much of your faith or commitment to your faith is based on this argument? How influential was this argument in you coming to faith, or did you learn it after you became a Christian? Tell us about that.
Good. So it had no bearing on me coming to faith. I was raised in a Christian home. I have one of those boring testimonies.
Yeah, me too.
I wasn't a drug addict who found Jesus. I wasn't in prison or anything like that. My father was a godly man who raised me in the Methodist Church, and even though I've departed from the Methodist Church, I've always appreciated what I received there. And so I don't have that kind of testimony. I just believed it's always been strange to me to think that there isn't a God. The one qualification there is I went through a personal crisis of faith after losing my wife, and I began to doubt God's very existence. But besides that couple of years long struggle, I never really doubted God's existence. I got interested in these arguments because I kept getting pushback from people saying, well, there's no evidence for God. Now, a lot of atheists would just say, well, you just found what you're looking for. I mean, I guess that's possible. I mean, psychoanalyzing me is a fruitless endeavor because, make my motives as saintly or sinister as you please. The argument is the argument. You can just look at the argument. The fact that I'm presenting it, obviously I have a motive. I want you to be convinced that God exists because I think this is important. But I would never give an argument that I didn't think was sound. I would never give an argument that I didn't study and vet and go back and forth on. And for whatever it's worth, the very first essay I ever wrote on this argument was an essay against the argument. So I was not initially convinced. I wrote it my first year in seminary. It was in a course on Thomas Aquinas. My professor was Van Tillian in his apologetic orientation, so that influenced me a bit. But I remember reading J.L. Mackey's critique of a version of the argument I just gave and being convinced by it. But I didn't stop just with that, 15 or 20 page essay, however long it was. I didn't stop with that essay and say, oh, I know all about that argument, because I knew that there were really intelligent people that disagreed with me and I wanted to know why. So I would read and read and read. And it was R.C. Sproul. He was one of the main catalysts for me changing my mind on the argument. I read his book, Not a Chance. And as I looked at how he dealt with some of the concerns Mackey raised, he wasn't interacting with Mackey. But having had read Mackey, I realized okay, Sproul is actually answering one of those arguments that Mackey gave. And so I would just remember going, wow, I mean, this is really insightful. And so then I got back on the bandwagon of really trying to get to the bottom of this argument. So it's been a long process of me just studying it. You run into a lot of, it's like they say, scholars will end up kissing a lot of frogs as they're reading essays on a topic because, you know, a lot of people are just saying the same thing over and over again. You're like, okay, I've heard this. But then you kiss a couple of princesses when you read a really good essay and you're like, okay, this is insightful. And as I got into people like Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, people that followed him, they really opened my eyes to just how powerful this argument is. And that's why the argument is very important for my apologetic. Um, it also influences the way I see things theologically and how I interpret the Bible, even.
Uh-huh.
I don't want to sit there and say, I don't want to ram the Bible through my metaphysics. So I do think that we need to let the Bible speak for itself as to what it says about God. But I do see a confluence between biblical revelation and what this argument is doing, so that it really does fit like a hand in the glove. And it really does open up so many vistas, if you will, in terms of how to just sort of appropriate scripture intellectually. So if you were to convince me to my satisfaction that the argument is unsound, that would create a huge paradigm shift in me at this point.
So again, when you're having a hard time, maybe struggling with something in your head that you can't figure out, or you're doubting God, or there's just a crisis in Travis's life, do you go to this argument among other things to help sustain you, or are there more personal
Yeah.
connections you have with God, or how does that work for you?
When I went through my crisis of faith, this argument was one of the arguments that sustained me in the sense that I couldn't get around it. And so I was like, well, I
Yeah,
have to believe that God exists because, I mean, this is just too powerful of an argument. If I had any inkling to abandon God, it would have been those years ago when I was going through my crisis. And that would have been the time for me to, and I questioned the argument, I attacked it, I did the things that you do when you're going through something like that. Now, if I'm going through something that I find challenging or I'm struggling through something, if it's an emotional issue, then I'm not really reflecting theologically. I'm going to my Bible, I'm going to my pastor, I'm going to Christian friends like you and sharing my problems. I think that's how
yeah,
we should deal with our issues. Um, but if it's an intellectual struggle, let's say I just got Sobel's book Logic and Theism. It finally fell to a price, and I got a paperback version that I could afford all that stuff. So I just got that not too long ago, and I'm not reading it all the way through cover to cover yet. I just don't have time, but I am reading the section on Aquinas. And when he got to the infinite regress, he goes, think about this. This seems very, hard to deny, like this issue that you can't have an infinite regressive causes. Now, I don't know how he's going to end with that. Is he going to try to show that even though it doesn't seem that way, um, it is that way? I'm not sure how he's going to deal with it.
yeah.
But it is interesting that even he is saying, look, this is not, you can't just laugh off the infinite regress. You can't laugh that insight off. The idea that infinite regresses can exist is not something that you could accept just glibly, because nobody really deep down accepts the idea that you can just have an infinite regressive
Right.
causes. Richard Dawkins, when he attacks the design argument, I think I may have mentioned this before, but he says, well, who designed the designer? Well, what he's getting at is that you can't have an infinite regresses of designers. If you have an infinite regresses of designers, then you don't really have an explanation of anything.
That's right.
Um, so in other contexts, atheists are just going to deny infinite regresses. We all intuitively realize Infogressives explain nothing. And this is one of the concerns I raised in my conversation with Bevar and Watkins. Bevar doesn't believe that any causes occur simultaneously, one with another. So a common example that Thomas used that goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas himself is in order to explain the kind of causal series we're talking about, he uses the illustration of a man moving a stick that moves a stone. So the
Yeah.
mind moves the hand, moves the stick, that moves the stone. Well, intuitively, we kind of realize what's causing the stone to roll is the immediate contact that stick has with the stone. And Bevar does a whole analysis of the illustration, which incidentally isn't meant to prove anything, it's meant to illustrate a point. You can have a thing called what we call a vertical or per se series of causes, where they're all simultaneous and they're all happening at once. Remove one of those causes and the ultimate effect just goes away. So if the mind stops moving the hand, the stone's no longer going to move.
Right.
And he thinks that even though the stick is pressed against the stone, what causes the stone to move is the prior movement of the stick, not the stick actually pressing against the stone. So that for Bevar and Watkins, I guess, causality is never simultaneous. It's always temporal. Now, if they can establish that, theism is cooked because, or at least classical theism, because now God can't be atemporal. Because all of what God does, if God is outside of time, all of what he does is simultaneous and eternal. Right? He's never done and God has never like said, okay, I'm going to create the universe. Okay, now I'm going to sustain it. And now I'm going to do this. He doesn't do that. He doesn't think in succession. He does everything at once, and then it falls out into time successively. But the
Right.
cause-effect relationship is a simultaneous cause-effect relationship. The effect is temporal, but the cause is eternal. And if you get rid of simultaneous causality, as he's trying to do, classical theism is cooked. It just is. But I just find it so implausible, not only because it's easy to find examples of simultaneous causality, so that the idea is a coherent notion. For example, Richard in the debate used an example of a boot just on the sand, but just imagine a statue standing on a beach from all eternity. Now, the footprints in the sand created by that statue, like it's the statue of a man, a stone statue, the footprints in the sand are the effects of the feet pressing on it. And that is simultaneous causality, because take the footprints off and the water comes and washes that all away immediately. So the reason the footprints remain in the sand is because of the simultaneous causal relationship between the feet and the footprints. So there, I gave you an example of simultaneous causality.
Yeah.
It's very easy. But I would venture to say that all causal relationships are simultaneous. The impact between the cause and effect must be immediate and simultaneous. The only question is whether it's concurrent or continuous. So, like my being conceived by my father, I mean, when the sperm hit the egg, that was a simultaneous, impactful cause-effect relation. But I'm not currently being caused to exist by my father.
Right.
So you could imagine as a logical possibility that the universe is eternal. It never began to exist. But each effect that occurs in our universe occurs because a cause simultaneously made it real. Two rocks crashing into each other. The crash, the impact, is what caused them to break apart. Or a father conceiving a son, father and mother conceiving a son, or a stick rolling a stone. It doesn't matter what example you give. All causal relationships are simultaneous. But if the kind of God we're talking about doesn't exist, it would simply mean that there is no per se series of causal relationships that is vertical in character, where I'm currently being caused by oxygen by the atmosphere, by the sun, and so forth, and just on we go. That's all that's all not, that just isn't true. What you have is only a per accident series that just goes all the way back in the past, but you still have an explanation for each event because the explanation is simultaneous. The causes are simultaneous with their effects. Remove that simultaneity. Now you're off and running in an infinite regress that just can't explain anything. Because if my action, if what's going on right now is explained by a prior moment, but not any impact between the cause and its effect, then what explained that prior moment? Well, it has to be a prior moment to that, then to that, then to that,
Right.
then to that, and you don't have an explanation of anything. Like Richard Dawkins would say, who designed the designer? Who caused that prior event?
It just seems like they have to argue that there is some kind of delay between every cause and effect. And then what happens during that delay that causes the cause from the effect? It disconnects them in some way. So really, they're arguing there is no cause and effect at all, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, it does emasculate the notion of causality. That's for
Yeah.
sure. I mean,
Okay.
yeah, that's a very good insight. I mean, why even speak of causes and effects at that point? Just say random events happening.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So I want to
Bertrand
switch.
Russell,
Go ahead.
Bertrand Russell tried to get rid of the idea of an efficient cause, and eventually came around to accepting it because he couldn't deny the fact that if I look outside and see the tree outside, the tree is causing me to have a perception, and that just is what we mean by efficient causality. And so, again, the notion of causality is deeply just grounded in our experiences of the world. We can't understand perception without cause effect relationships.
It seemed to me while I was listening to the debate that the other side really has to argue against just basic common sense notions, ideas like,
Yeah,
any effect has anything that exists has to have a
yeah.
cause. That just seems, that's sort of the way we think about the world. And then all of a sudden they want to argue against that. But anyway, we've only got 3 minutes left. I want to switch back to the history of the argument itself.
Mhm.
Can we say in the time between Christ or Aristotle and Aquinas that this argument was being developed slowly, or did Aquinas really grab a hold of a few little pieces and come up with this thing whole cloth?
The argument goes all the way back to Aristotle, and so Aristotle died in 322 BC. And in metaphysics, the most famous passage that he covers the argument in is the 12th book of his Metaphysics. Um, Now he's concentrating just on motion, where he reasons to an unmoved mover. The debate is whether Aristotle believed that that the unmoved mover is efficiently causing the universe. And I know this can get technical, but the standard interpretation is that the motion in the universe moves towards the unmoved mover, kind of like a lover moves towards her beloved.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people interpret Aristotle, most people interpret Aristotle as believing that the unmoved mover doesn't know the universe exists. And Luther compared Aristotle's God to sort of a blind maid rocking her cradle. So if you have that image, um, God, the unmoved mover, is always just thinking thoughts, and so the universe has to move towards a goal. There's this inbuilt teleology to it. So the universe is moving towards a certain goal and is trying to achieve a union with the unmoved mover. Now it never can, because then it would become unmoved, and the universe can't be unmoved. It's always moving. So it's just it's gone on for all eternity. The universe is just moving in this direction, and the unmoved mover is literally ignorant of the universe. The unmoved mover thinks of the unmoved mover, and that's all. It's thought thinking itself. Now, I disagree with that interpretation of Aristotle. David Bradshaw wrote a book called Aristotle East and West, and he convinced me, with a lot of careful exegesis of Metaphysics, book 12, that Aristotle himself believed that the unmoved mover is the efficient cause of the universe, meaning he reduces the potential of the universe to exist to actuality, to speak in Thomas's terms. And so there is a confluence between what Aristotle is doing and what Thomas is doing. Aristides is the oldest Christian apologist, writing around the year 120. He gives this argument. You see the argument all through the history of theistic thought.
Hmm.
And Thomas is actually borrowing from a lot of people, including Moses Maimonides, Avicenna, Averroes, a lot of people that preceded him, both in the Muslim and Christian tradition, Jewish traditions, rather, use the argument, and he's using versions that they gave as well. His first three arguments for God's existence among his five ways are considered all cosmological type arguments. They kind of have this flavor to them. One focuses on motion, one focuses on the idea of efficient causality, and one focuses on contingency. So that's a
And
very
then,
quick
yeah,
summary.
has the argument been developed since Aquinas, or did he pretty much put the cherry on it?
Like the version that I gave is a Thomistically inspired argument.
Okay.
And there are a lot of those. Stuart Hackett has one. Norman Geisler had one. He was the first person to present the argument to me when I read his book on apologetics. Ed Feser has several versions. I agree with Gavin Kerr, though. I think that Thomas actually gave the argument, and that argument is sufficient to prove God's existence. The modern versions are mainly developed to speak to a modern audience.
Oh, I see.
But I don't think that my version that I gave in the debate is necessary. I just think it's a good way of just trying to pare down the argument to be somewhat digestible to a modern audience. I know it's difficult because you're learning new jargon as you're moving through the argument, so it takes a while to chew on.
Yeah. Well, Travis, we're out of time.
Always.
I just want to say, Christianity withstands, one more attack on the highest intellectual level that it can. I was very impressed with you and Richard and your performance, and actually your opponents as well. It was a very gracious debate. It's the way that they all should be done. So good job on that. I really enjoyed it, and
I like those guys myself. I really do. I really got to like them.
Oh, that's great. That's the way it should be, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully we'll be discussing things in the future. So I hope it's not over for us. So.
All right, brother. See you next week.
Bye-bye.